Good evening, welcome. I'm quite awed by the company today, flanked between the two Bombay princes, one from Harvard University and the other from Princeton. It's a true privilege to have you, Gyan, and you, Rahul, with us. I know neither of you need an introduction, so I'll make this brief. Gyan Prakash teaches history of modern India at Princeton University and has written several books, one of them being Bonded Histories, Genealogies of Labor, Servitude in Colonial India. He also wrote the famous Mumbai Fables, which is the one that perhaps immediately connected his interest to Meera's work when they met via Meera's daughter, Meera Devidayal, when she was studying at Princeton way back in 1989. Mumbai Fables is now going to be the screenplay for a film, Bombay Velvet, directed by Anurag Kashyap. So, Gyan, you remain to be a true straddler of the real Bombay world with Bollywood in your pocket too. Rahul Mehrotra is the founder principal of RMA Architects, professor of urban design and planning, and the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at Harvard University. Rahul has co-authored Bombay, The Cities Within, with Sharda Dwivedi, who will always be remembered at any mention of the city, as well as Conserving an Image Center, the Fort Precinct in Bombay. So while both Gyan and Rahul might live and teach in America, have their heart firmly entwined around the city of Bombay. Rahul and Meera go back years ago, almost to the first small architectural job Rahul made when he started his architectural foray in the 90s. We owe this evening to you, Meera, for bringing together these two luminaries under one roof. The discussion that follows takes off from Meera's exhibition. It will be a free-flowing conversation between Rahul and Gyan, one a practitioner, the other an academic, both authorities on this wonderful city of ours, throwing up conversations, room for discussions, and new thoughts to ponder on. I would like to give a special thank you to AVID, who have been co-partners with Chemould in promoting this venture. So a big hand to AVID as well. Thank you. And over to you, Rahul.
Yeah. So anyway, just to start off the conversation, I mean, Rahul, you've looked at and worked on mill lands a great deal. As a historian, of course, anything about Bombay, one has to, in a way, take the mill lands as a kind of anchor of its history through much of the 19th century and much of the 20th century. And of course, as a historian, when you look at mill lands today, the landscape has changed dramatically. You see, of course, debris all around, but you also see new stuff that's going on, new landscape that's emerging. Now, generally what happens is, as a historian, when you look at these pieces of history, the standard response, that's not the standard response, but the standard response is to be nostalgic about the world that we have lost. And when I saw the exhibit over here, what energized me was, in fact, the way in which Meera has responded to the debris as a kind of an experience, and then produced images to represent her experience. So this is a kind of a mill landscape that looks very different. But I'm just wondering, as a practitioner, when you look at first these images of mill lands and your own work with the mill lands, how do you kind of respond to this?
Wow. Okay. First of all, no, thanks for that, and it's wonderful being here and all of that. I mean, my involvement with the Minlands, just to be kind of very candid about it, was very background, behind the scenes, and I'm happy to talk about some of that because I think we have enough distance to do that, and at some point maybe we'll go into that history, which would be interesting, I think, to share. But it's wonderful that you framed this the way you did in terms of the debris and then her beginning, because Meera walked me around here 2 weeks ago, I think, and what really struck me, just in summation, was I said to myself, my gosh, if this exhibition had happened when the debate of the milllands was starting, would we have looked at some of this differently? And okay, what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is that I think clearly this is a view of a very particular landscape, as you've described it, through the lens and imagination of an artist. A novelist might imagine it and distill from it, something else. In the way Midnight's Children, Rushdie, I think it was wonderful the way he picked up on the debris or the kind of fragments of memory that he had of the city and writing about it 30 or 40 years later. But they were very powerful in terms of, I can remember many scenes. I'm sorry, I'm making a deviation, but that whole scene where they walk across the tetrapods and they begin to see these people begin to worship this as a phallic symbol, and the gynecologist goes berserk. But it actually, there were things on the below the surface that through that imagination one would see surfacing in the coming decades in the city. So these are little fragments that an artist or a novelist can somehow pick quite differently from a historian who has to quite systematically do that before speculating in some way, perhaps. So I think for me the exhibition was really a wonderful experience from this perspective. That is, one was seeing things one had been engaged with in the reality of the city as a professional, engaged with many other professionals, some of whom are here, who are much more engaged with the Milan. So it was through that lens of imagination that one saw this. And I just scribbled some sort of notes as Meera was talking to me. And I think the couple of things that occur to me here is that through this lens of the artist, there were actually multiple readings that collapsed together, which are normally, if we work systematically as planners or designers or historians, sometimes we sort of those adjacencies don't sort of occur to us. So I was looking at the Stairway to Nowhere, the playground, the tiger, and so then one can actually, your mind goes berserk and you kind of begin to imagine all sorts of things. And I was talking to Meera, is the tiger about nature reclaiming this? Is it about the Shiv Sena wanting to claim this in terms of land values? What is the symbolism? And actually it's all of that simultaneously that's represented. So I think through, as you described it, these fragments which she's picked up, the one thing that comes to mind is, well, not only multiple imaginations, but these incredible contestations that are potentially colliding here. Yeah. And of course that leads to the question of whose city, when you see that man drawing water, that suddenly where we are all getting tanker water, there's an excess of water, there's a kind of correction of an asymmetry where people who are in these interstitial spaces suddenly have access to incredible resources. And so it all turns everything a bit upside down. And so
one of the kind of interesting things I find that Meera's images, is not that of an ethnographer.
That's right.
She's not going there kind of documenting things, because obviously she, when you document, you don't see these kind of images, play people playing cricket behind those sort of windows. So this is what she's doing, and there is a kind of a playful collision of the past and the present. And I wonder, as a historian, she's not a historian, and maybe I'm attributing a great deal to it, or I'm reading into it. But as a historian, when I see work like this, I think of it as the work of an archaeologist. Just as an archaeologist, you dig as an is it better? As an archaeologist, as you dig through and you reveal surfaces and strata that are not easily visible, through the artist's eye, through these collisions, you begin to see aspects of Bombay's mill history that are not immediately visible. So, just take some of those images of, those archways, which call forth, the image of, the kind of dream of longevity that 19th century had. And if you walk through these mills, you really think that, these people thought that this would last forever. And in that dream of longevity, if you begin to kind of dig, okay, where did this dream come from? What permitted this dream? After all, these were, mills that were, built during the late 19th and early 20th century under British rule. Most of the machines came from Britain or subsequently from Germany. There was a whole kind of structure associated with it. And once you start colliding that past with the present, there are aspects of that past that, come before your eye, which the artist as a historian or artist as an archaeologist brings, brings into view for us. So, as I said, I'm not saying Meera is a historian, but as a historian, when I see this kind of work, I find there's a kind of an archaeological work that it does, which brings many of these things, to surface.
Right. No, and just to extend that a little bit, and this was something I responded to when Meera was taking me around, especially the panel that we see at that far end. It's actually an incredible archive because it's also a catalog of construction methods, materials, of time periods, and slices that she has picked, in a sense, intuitively through a visual eye, actually also become a catalog of material. But I'm going to just sort of pick up on something you said to extend this, Gyan, because this is something you've written passionately about. And I would love to hear your views on this. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of one landscape of modernity that faded away, leaving no remnants. I mean, they're just voids. They're fragments which Meera has picked up. But as you were describing the machinery, as you were describing new norms of working and this kind of industrial landscape, it was the landscape of modernity that had arrived here. And then you had, in another part of the city, another landscape of modernity, which is the Art Deco, the cinema theaters, Bollywood, all of which you're very engaged with. And in one case, it hasn't faded. And how do you think these things play out? And I mean, what would be your response to that kind of comparative between these two landscapes?
I'm thinking of this wonderful novel. I think it's called Night in Bombay. Louis Bromfield, who wrote, American writer who wrote in the 1930s. Most of the kind of a novel is set in the Taj. I mean, most of what occurs happens in the Taj, and it's about these Americans who come and, and then they encounter this India. And what you do get through that, I mean, they also venture out into the mill lands and they venture out into the chawls. And you do get this kind of, two sides of the same coin. That on the one side, there is a kind of a dream of this kind of, particularly in Bombay, unlike, let's say, Delhi in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you have this dream of international modernity, and Art Deco is part of it. But the flip side of it are the chawls, and the flip side of it are the mill lands, and the two sort of go together, and one often doesn't see the connection between the two, although they were integrally connected those days. Now, that, that Art Deco dream and, that dream of industrial modernity is also, I think, kind of mildewed and faded, as has the surface of all those kind of Marine Drive Art Deco apartments. And now you have a new kind of a dream that's emerging, and which I think is very much present in those kind of IPL images that one sees. A new kind of city, or those images of new, towers that are emerging. And this is a different kind of image of, global modernity, which is, it doesn't have a kind of a social vision. The earlier industrial modernity had a certain kind of a social vision of, that it would modernize the society, it would bring new culture, it would bring new kinds of citizens, it would bring new kind of people. I mean, this is a total kind of, market-based idea of modernity, and I think, Bollywood is very much part of it.
So when you say she's not being nostalgic, what you're implying is she's being speculative in a sense by encompassing these images within the fragments that she's on. Is that correct?
I mean, I do think that, when you see this very startling image of, through, the television frame, when you see Virat Kohli, that collision of the past and the present kind of jars loose and makes you ask, what is it that has rendered this history? Why is it that we consider this as past? You know, when we say this is history, we say it's dead, it's over with. But when you see that image contraposed to that of, Virat Kohli, then you ask, what is it that has rendered this history? What has made this the past? And there you say, it's this kind of market-based vision that has now rendered this past, so that now we can say these mill lands are fit for building new kinds of towers, for malls, new kind of a life. That's what rendered this as history, as dead, as past.
But then the existence of the fragments are yet exerting their presence in terms of the question of memory. And so there is an interesting tension in each one of those images. And therefore, I mean, I'm sorry I'm asking these questions, but I think just as a way of, is then what is, I mean, in a city like this, for all of us where we are struggling with the question of memory, in some parts of the city it's more stable, at least in the way it's embodied in its architecture. In some parts it's much more fragile, as what we've seen in the Midlands. And for me, one of the interesting things about the tension in these images is it kind of, it plays those off simultaneously. There's a simultaneity there of the exertion of the fragments. In fact, because they're borne down to their minimal, just as the frame of the wall or, just the presence of a void, which is a well, somehow the exertion of that memory of those fragments is much stronger than if one saw, a well-preserved facade among high-rise buildings. So,
I mean, I think those fragments actually work as question marks. And that's why we tend to think of it, if you put it in a museum as a material artifact belonging to the 19th century, that would have a different kind of an effect. But when it is placed, for example, when you have all these people who have, now living in the mill lands and using, water from there, the same, that water which was used for machinery is now being used for something else. That acts as, I think, those fragments then act as a question mark, exerting a pressure on the present, asking the present, it has a kind of a haunting presence in the present, asking the present to explain itself. Normally, history, you tend to think in this kind of evolutionary fashion. After the 18th century, you had 19th century. After the 19th century, you had 20th century. You have industrial capitalism, and now you have finance capitalism, and so on. If you think of it in that evolutionary fashion, you will never, or at least, from my point of view, I see these fragments questioning that kind of evolutionary history. It's like, I find that at Chor Bazaar. In Chor Bazaar, when you see all these artifacts from different periods taken away from that context and placed together in or juxtaposed in this kind of a tension with each other, they begin to kind of question each other's sort of a natural appearance. You see an artifact in its own time, it seems to acquire a kind of a natural presence. So you say, let's say, neo-Gothic building of the 19th century, if you see in the 19th century context, then, it seems natural. You place it in the 21st century, juxtaposed to a 21st century tower, suddenly that fragment begins to acquire a different kind of a life, and not in that kind of natural presence.
So if I extend that just to perhaps even edge on being controversial, then would one kind of extend and logically conclude that our strategies for conservation, which, I mean, conservation, some people call it preservation, but we call it conservation because it implies a more dynamic process. And conservation, I'm sorry, because this is one big question that comes up when we look at the Midlands. I'm sort of going into conservation now as a debate because I think you've set the ground beautifully for that. So conservation, occurs in societies for various reasons. So, I mean, I think when we see it in extreme forms, as we've seen in a lot of Europe, it was a reaction to the world wars where things were demolished. Dresden was built per se. So it becomes a way that society in its broadest sense, at least for me, conservation in its broadest sense, is a way that society modulates the rate of change within the planning discourse in urban areas. Now we extend it to rural landscapes because there's such incredible transformation. So it's a modulator, right? Another view of conservation is one that's purely nostalgic, of memory per se, which is what it's become through the narratives largely that have come from UK and not even all parts of Europe, but UK. So if you take a more dynamic or more speculative form of conservation, it's much looser. In fact, what you were describing just now about the power of fragments versus is a wonderful way to see this transition that a city makes from one era to another, albeit maybe too fast for some of us, but it does happen. Now, if you talk to conservationists about it, it's bizarre. I mean, this is like the worst thing that's happened. Where do we place ourselves? I mean, I don't even expect you to answer this. I'm just raising these as interesting questions that an exhibition like this raises, because it actually challenges even our business as usual kind of attempts at framing the narratives of conservation.
Yeah. I mean, one of the, issues, I mean, it's connected to conservation, but, how we deal with historical artifacts is a larger question about history. What happens is you take a historical artifact and you impose, or the present imposes its own interpretation on it. So you place it in a certain way in a museum. You arrange a certain itinerary by which you come across that artifact. So you first go to the 18th century, then you go to the 19th century. So this is the way in which past is enslaved by the present. How do we let, in a way, past speak for itself and question the present? And I think the only way you can do it is when you remove it from its kind of a natural context. You remove it from, all the ways in which, a particular artifact acquires, kind of a natural home. And what happens in nostalgic history, you take a particular kind of artifact and say, you should surround it with other period details. If you surround it with other period details, it acquires a certain kind of authenticity. People think, well, now, like often people have arguments about, I mean, this is an argument that, happened, for example, this might make sense to you. It was an architectural debate in Princeton. Many of the buildings are like Oxbridge buildings, right? And then new buildings were proposed. And some people said, no, it should be like that, because otherwise it would be out of place. So they wanted, 21st century building to look like buildings which were built in the 19th century, which themselves were trying to ape 13th century. Okay? Then the counter argument was, no, you build buildings according to sensibilities that sort of make sense today, and if there is a kind of a collision between these different styles, it will actually produce provocative thought about what those different buildings mean, rather than creating a certain kind of homogeneous sense of a single style. In the same way, I think when you take a material artifact from a particular time and you try to only surround it with artifacts that share its sensibility or share its time, you in fact create, from the point of view of the present, an artificial home for that artifact. And I'm suggesting that, the collision of the past and the present is extremely important in order for us to actually really understand what that past means. Otherwise, it's like, to take a very absurd example, in many science fiction films, American films, when you have people coming from another planet, they look like Americans. I mean, really, they don't really look different. They are white people, they might have slightly different nose, but they are Americans. In the same way, if the present were to make the past appear like the present, what's the point?
No, so and I think just to nuance that a little further, and you use the example of Princeton, and in liberal arts colleges with banks, there's the politics of age, because they want to reinforce the idea that they've been custodians of the continuity of knowledge and all of that. So I think sometimes that comes in the way of the debate, and in some other conditions, especially where finance is involved, where global capital is attracted, some of these collisions become much more adaptable. I mean, I'm just nuancing what you're saying, but I mean, I don't disagree with what you've sort of mentioned.
Should we?
Well, actually, Meera, is this making sense? I mean,
I don't know.
Is this completely bizarre? No.
All the interpretations you put on my work, which are really giving it many layers that I never even thought of.
Actually, she emailed us and told us these were all things.
I have to say one thing, that if any of these layers or any of these ideas have come through, I really have to thank Gyan for it. Because, when I first started working on this, can you hear me? Even without the mic, Gyan. No, what I wanted to say was that when I first started working on this, I was actually, my whole show, or whatever, the whole work was triggered by one or two images, which was really this monumental mill overgrown with wonderful green foliage, stone walls, three sort of arches high and all. And I sort of showed them very excitedly to Gyan. And I said, Gyan, look what I'm sort of beginning to find interesting. And he said to me, he says, just be careful about one thing. You can very easily fall into romantic nostalgia. So, just be aware of that. So I said, yeah, okay, thanks. And now what? And then he went back, he was on his way, he was going to Princeton soon after. And sure enough, about a week or 10 days later, I got this huge file on my mail. And it was obviously one of the most famous pieces of history writing, whatever, which I, in my ignorance, had not even been aware of, which was Walter Benjamin's Arcades Project. And, I had read it and I read it again, and I had to read it 2 or 3 times to really make sense of it, because it's so layered, so dense. But that actually was what got me started into looking at things in the way that, again, not consciously, but I think what came through to me through that was, and I have to thank Gyan for that, is that, something like these arcades of Paris. I mean, I'd been to Paris so many times, I didn't even know they existed. And in that time, which was not that long ago, 1920s or something, or 18, I don't know, 18, yeah. They were sort of the biggest happening in their time, the sort of the first manifestations of great architecture coming out of the discovery of iron. Now, to think that, in 1920s or whatever, they were in their heyday, and until I didn't even know they existed. It just made me think that, these mills also, when they were built, I mean, if you look at them with all this stone and the detailing and all that, they were not meant to be washed out in less than 100 years. So there's something about this whole cycle of time, the wheel of time, and I think it was like that. Everything has its day, it's up, down, and something else takes over, not necessarily something we like or we can approve of, but if that's how it is, you just go along with it and see what the next thing comes up with. This was the sort of trajectory which, for better or worse, Gyan is responsible for.
No, I mean, when I first saw the images that Meera was doing, I mean, the first thought really came to me was Walter Benjamin, because the way in which he had treated debris and ruin as a kind of a rag picker. And I said, Meera is also like a rag picker. And what does the rag picker do? Rag picker, he picks whatever he finds valuable and then finds new value in it. Things that we throw away, the rag picker finds a new value in it. And Meera was like a rag picker. She was collecting these things and finding new value in it, and finding new value in it not just by collecting, but also adding new kind of images and interpretations to them. And in the process of doing it, she was, that's why, again I'm saying that, you're not a historian, but I see you as an archaeologist, who by doing this was creating these kinds of new layers of meaning, which as a historian I could then, say, well, this is an aspect of history that in its own time these artifacts couldn't tell, because they were suffused with the ideology of the kind of 19th century, of a kind of triumph, the mills will come, India will become different, people will become different and so on. They shared that kind of a triumphalist ideology. Today, they're devoid of that, triumphalism. And you see these things as kind of bereft, desolate, abandoned, only for the rag picker. And then the rag picker will find a new kind of value in it. And so, so I was actually really taken up by that image, and I thought, Walter Benjamin, what he had done with sort of Parisian arcades and, in his other writings, offered a very nice way to kind of think about these images.
Sure.
Should we kind of open it up and...
No, could I just add to on this comment? So you want questions? You can do that. I mean, I wanted to just pick up on something she said. Could I just first finish picking up on what you said, Meera? You were, I think it's very interesting. I just want to sort of also connect it to my own interest in a way, and some other people here who might be. I mean, the question of planning, because it's an amazing example in the moment of the history of the city that, a lot of us refer to it as a lost opportunity and what it could have done for the city, and there's a whole imagination there. And so I just wanted to pick up on what Meera kind of said in passing. Things are built for 100 years, and then you actually, so basically, I think it's interesting that, and even having studied it and now taught it, one of the big gaps in just planning discourse generally is the notion of time. We've always had end state planning. We've had, responses like yours that, people thought it would be for 100 years, but it goes. The temporal landscape isn't taken seriously. Temporality isn't taken seriously. And I just believe in today's world, if one factored that in, we would have a different imagination of how cities are made. And I think for me, in many ways, what I see here, I read it through that. If I read it through the lens of a planner with these lacunas that I see within it, it actually speaks to me from that perspective in very, very powerful ways. So to just share for a minute, just in recall almost, what I started by saying, there's a kind of history here which is interesting. And this is just my own recall of, say, 20 or 25 years in this whole process as a practitioner here, not being totally involved. It's very interesting, if you look at cities generally, cities grow in two ways. Cities grow either by opening up new land, which is what New Bombay was about, those imaginations were about, or cities grow by recycling existing land. These are the two mechanisms cities use. And if you look at cities around the world, the healthiest ones like London, San Francisco, all of these cities are cities that are doing that simultaneously. In Mumbai, what has happened, and I think the mill, therefore, is a moment that we should look at critically in that history, is we've swung from the other. We haven't had the ability to deal with these two scales simultaneously. So the 60s were full, as you've written in your book and things, were full of these imaginations of New Bombay, of opening up new land, these mega kind of gestures and all of that. And suddenly we swang to the other extreme. So in the 60s and 70s, the heroes within the profession were people who could imagine these new towns. And then in the 90s, the heroes were a lot of us who could fix a pavement, put street furniture, fix a building's facade. We swung to a kind of micro scale, forgetting about this broader imagination. And look at what's happened in New Bombay now. They've sold the land, the SEZs, the Ambanis own more than half that land, etc. It's ridiculous. So I think this ability to engage simultaneously is very important. So in that history, where does the mill land kind of come in? And I'm not going to go into one third, or any of that, don't worry. But it really, when this began to let me say this first, that I think and this is again why I said it's important to see this, because I wish there were discussions and things like this while that was happening in the late 80s and 90s, because there was no imagination about these places. It was this thing, suddenly it became a hotbed as the mills closed down because property prices. And I remember there was a seminar, the UDR I did, called Public Places, where Charles Correa, Sen Kapadia, people from KRV presented this, and it became a hot thing in the press because there was one image which showed this becoming a gallery or becoming some kind of space. And you know, so then if you think back, they were really, it was a polarization between two groups, and they were both two groups from civil society. So there was one group in civil society that was from civil society that was imagining this based on other examples of globalization and how can this become a landscape for art and galleries, and you know how we can recycle the land. There was this whole imagination of a place that people were seeing around the world. And then there was another kind of reaction also from civil society about displacement, labor rights, you know, all of that, and families, and they were both completely valid, absolutely valid. They were both speaking a completely different language, and there was no common ground, there was no armature within which they could come and settle within each other or even into a dialogue in a productive way. And I think personally, if I look back retrospectively, that was a space that many people took advantage of in terms of the development. So the Charles Correa Commission, which was appointed much later, came out of really some backdoor maneuvering with D.T. Joseph, who was the Urban Development Secretary. We had just successfully got the Fort area declared a precinct, so that precedent existed of making a special planning zone, and D.T. Joseph decided that we should do that for the mill land, and he appointed Charles Correa to. And that was actually really an attempt to reconcile these two visions in some way, bringing housing, bringing all sorts of things, land banking. But you know, really, again, one can say this, and very carefully but critically, it was too late. The profession should have been on top of this in the 70s and 80s. And I think the reason the profession wasn't top of this in the 70s and 80s was because we were swinging between big visions and micro improvements in our area. I mean, just in a retrospective way. And so I think that's interesting, because I think when she was taking me around here, I thought, my God, you know, maybe if we had many photographers, we had you know, artists who were sort of bringing this as a center point in the imagination of the city, maybe we would have engaged with it differently. It was a landscape no one even, I mean, some people knew these mills existed. It wasn't central to the imagination of the city. And I won't go into this detail, but this is the same thing with the eastern waterfront now. It's now with that freeway, we are beginning to see all this land. But it's not central to imagination. And I think the artists can be, and this is a way of at least concluding my comments in a complimentary way, I think artists can be part of this process as much as historians and archaeologists and architects and planners and poets and artists. I mean, Sudhir Patwardhan caught some of these landscape in a particular moment, but with a different spin. And I think, therefore, when we are dealing with such complex parts of the city, I mean, the idea that it is not the planner or the architect who should be the prima donna here, but the fact that we have to somehow find as society a way that we can make all these discussions and these different imaginations productive in terms of their inspiration to each other, I think is something we need to look at quite seriously.
I mean, I agree with you entirely that it precisely during the period when, you know, the city has emerged as you know, central to kind of imagination everywhere, you know, and the importance of city in you know, social life has become you know, very prominent in the, like, let's say 90s and, you know, in 2000s and so on. And one has seen a great deal of engagement with the city, you know, by artists, by urban activists, by, you know, various people like that. And I was just thinking, as you were speaking about, you know, the engagement with public space. Now here you see engagement with public space, and I was just thinking of, you know, Hindi cinema since the mid-90s and up until now. It actually, much of Hindi cinema retreated from the public space into kind of an interior space. And if you think of all the kind of big films from the late 90s and 2000s, most of the kind of action takes place in interior space or in shopping malls. I mean, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham, the most dramatic moment actually happens in a shopping mall. You know, the narrative closure occurs over there. So there was a kind of a retreat from the kind of public space and the city, precisely at a time when the city was becoming increasingly important in public consciousness. In cinema, the kind of opposite happens, and much of the kind of narrative occurs in the interior. I mean, maybe, you know, this will change with Bombay Velvet.
You're aware, but Gyan has written the screenplay for a film that's being directed by Anurag Kashyap and about to be released in November. So, you know, he's, apart from his history background, there's a foreground to him too, huh? In his maverick activities of screenplay writer and the obsession with Bollywood, right, Gyan?
Yeah, the film set in the 60s. Late 60s, and actually when I was first pitching it, I used to say, it's Casablanca meets Chinatown in Bombay in the 1960s. Yeah.
The question actually is for both of you. It's very interestingly, you first of all, you brought this notion of a kind of new modernity that is paralleling, or let's say succeeding the landscape of the mill lands. And the second notion that he brought up was the kind of changes in the forms of labor that kind of actually affects the actual form, the formulation of the new modernity into the form of these new towers and so on and so forth. And so these are the two crucial issues here that we are looking at. That do you think that what is basically missing is the kind of space of representation for this kind of modernity that is coming? Perhaps more crucial question than the kind of shifting landscape is the kind of, do you think that the space of representation for this modernity, or even to say the imagination, which, because you know, Renaissance and let's say the industrial modernity, like you said, had an inclusive vision about almost kind of how the world would change after that, but this kind of modernity has got no no inclusive vision. Do you think we are missing a collective space of representation for this modernity?
Oh, okay. I thought you're the expert. No, I mean, from my perspective, you know, I see this shift, and actually Gyan helped me develop some of these ideas in a seminar he invited me to in the Kinetic City, is I see this shift as, you know, in the post-industrial economy, you get a fragmentation of all of this, and it creates a particular kind of space, which we are not equipped within the disciplines even to deal with. And I think it's playing itself out in the most extreme forms in places like India for various reasons of democracy, or, you know, in whatever mutinous democracy we kind of deal with. And so the vision that exists that people can grasp onto, which I'm sorry to say our new government has already started pounding on, is the kind of vision which then, you know, becomes it doesn't allow that kind of inclusiveness just because of the form. It creates very brittle urban form in the form of these stars, what I've written about as the architecture of impatient capital that comes and sort of reorganizes space in a very particular way. And, you know, I think it's of course got to do with representation, but it's also got to do, and that's why I was very interested as Gyan was talking about this, and I asked the question about conservation, because conservation gets co-opted into this process of globalization very easily, and it starts. Architecture actually is it's an instrument that can create very hard thresholds or can create soft thresholds, and the form makes a big difference. And I think we are co-opting this. And I, you know, when I heard the president announce what this new government was going to do, and they announced 100 new cities, it was like a bizarre moment for me. China, when they set out 15 years ago, announced 50 new cities. They were not even that ambitious. 50, of which there may be 2 or 3 cities have worked even halfway. In spite of that autocracy, the rest are speculative, generic landscapes which don't even have people living there. And we are talking about building 100 new cities. I've got to stop because I'll go into a whole other thing. But you know what the government should have said is, by India's 75 years in independence, we're going to have 100 great cities. we're going to turn our cities around. That would be a statement, then that would engage our imagination. So this narrative of the new town, the new city, the particular kinds of forms that come from these kind of global imaginations and then become this new form of modernity are extremely dangerous in the way they begin to universalize urban landscapes. And so I think, again, collectively, we have to change that narrative dramatically, and it'll be much messier. So for example, now that I'm just sort of speculating, because with Meera walking around, for me this was a way that you created an armature for us to speculate. So that open space where the cricket is being played and there's the carcass or the armature of the mill, those should become community spaces where people are allowed to put up mandaps for weddings, for Ganesh, and you begin to have, that becomes the, so that becomes the contemporary that begins to engage with this on a temporal scale. And that becomes the kind of city imagination that we have to sort of engage with, I believe. I mean, I'm just one fragment here.
In fact, you must know this Lina Bardi's work in Sao Paulo, where this was very much like an old mill area. It was an industrial power plant or something, a huge space. Today, it is such an active, alive public space where you have people playing chess, and there are, all sorts of, schools for, young and senior citizens to learn various kinds of crafts, and there are thousands of people who participate in it, and the city has actually assisted in this kind of transformation. I mean, it's a small example, but this is what could happen with these spaces if the imagination is begins with the public rather than the market. I mean, what happens right now? I mean, you're thinking about the industrial modernity to, let's say, contemporary modernity. One, with all its problems, the modernism of an earlier time had a social vision. It thought of citizens. The contemporary version of modernity that we have begins from the other end. It starts with the market and thinks of citizens as a byproduct of the market. So obviously then you will start with smart cities rather than you'll start with people who will live and make up the city. You're saying passivity of, I don't think citizens are passive. I mean there's plenty of activity going on, and plenty of desires. It's just a question of can they make themselves heard? But that's a kind of a political question.
Just to add to the debate, my interpretation on seeing this was the current past with the recent past, in the sense the mills are ruined. We've not gone to the past when the workers were working in the mills. And then you talk about capitalism being in ruins. So out of ruins you have had these fancy skyscrapers, and the lives of the workers got ruined when the mills were leveled. And that links in with the concept of time being eternal, past, present, future. This is just an observation of mine.
Thanks. Ranjit, I think, has a...
Hi, I just had a short question. Would you agree with me that, although I'm paraphrasing somebody else, that India at this particular moment is disoriented about its post-colonial or post-independence architectural identity? That it's disoriented or it's confused, and the presence of these mills is therefore symbolic of that disorientation, that there's no larger plan, that we haven't seemed to...
Yeah, look, I mean, just a very brief response to that. I think at independence, the nation had a nation or national identity construction project. So it was very clear we were constructing an identity for the nation. By the 80s, I think as our politics got fractured into regional politics, our identities also became very multiple. Because, and there's a whole history here at the cusp, the debate, how the modernists won, Chandigarh, Corbusier, Nehru's vision, etc. But by the 80s, our politics became very regional, very coalition-oriented. existed, you began to have regional identities express themselves. There was a resurfacing of traditions that existed. We believed that we weren't a fractured society in terms of caste, religion, but we were. For a moment of 2 decades within the project of national identity construction, we put all that on hold, so to speak. And also the architecture that was being made was highly centrally controlled, almost from Delhi all the time, in terms of what was being built. So there was a control on the architecture through the Central Public Works Department. And architects did small projects, the large projects were government control. So identity construction was very clear. Also within that kind of socialist kind of agenda and ideology and idealism, master planning was an instrument that, whether it was successful or not, it at least existed. So there were some metrics about employment, about housing, about entitlement housing. These were at least on paper, and some of it played itself out. In our post-liberalized economy, that gray zone of 2 decades, all this just faded. And I think the contestations, the disparities, the weird adjacencies that you're seeing is a kind of laissez-faire, where markets are bullying, land markets and all of that kind of thing. And so you're getting a very particular, and the state has moved into what Sunil Kilnani calls a statistical architecture of GDP, of connectivity, of highways. So the image construction is now freeways, and it's arrival and movement between, but not places per se. And so this is a big shift in terms of the national agenda. So I've just come back from Agra, driving down an incredible freeway where cars are turning over because tires burst and things, because this is the most amazing freeway. You come down in 2 hours from Agra to Delhi, and you pass a Formula 1 racing track, and you pass, it's just like a madness. You can't believe, but that's what the state is worrying about now, these moments and places of connection rather than arrival, in a sense, of places. So I think that's, in cities it's very extreme and acute, because that fragmentation begins to happen in the same space, so the adjacencies become even more bizarre. And the Dharavi example is one where these aspirations are being resisted, and it's interesting, I think. Yeah. Ranjit has been waiting. Oh, sorry.
A great opportunity to talk to a planner and a historian. Like the mills died down, over the past 100 years, you see them dying down continuously. What do you think will happen to our cities now? What is the next change? As an historian, with your experience and studied various cities, and as a planner, are we ready to regenerate, or we die?
Well, one of the things that I have seen a lot in Bombay is that the city has a great ability to morph itself into something else. So, for example, someone gets evicted. Unlike, let's say, in Delhi. In Delhi, although this also happens in Bombay, but more in Delhi, you'll get, let's say, a slum gets demolished and people get evicted, and they are placed outside in the outskirts, in Dakshinapuri and so on, and then you'll see in the morning they come in their bicycles to work. In Bombay, often when people get evicted or something, some demolition occurs, people make some other kind of a structure, an arrangement within or on the adjacent to the place where they have been evicted. And so, you could say that, this is also a great curse, but it's also a great way of survival in the city. So, I can't predict, what's going to happen. But, from what I can see, the great engines of change, the great drivers of change are the kinds of things that, Rahul was talking about, market-led change. But those kinds of changes, I don't think will produce the kind of, social vision that, people are looking for in a city, in a city that is a just city, a city that is, is fair to its residents. So, I'm sorry, that's not a very hopeful answer, but
Bombay bouncing back is more about its people rather than its environment. When you see the spirit of Bombay.
Yeah, so
It isn't going.
I'll zoom out of Bombay because Gyan talked about Bombay. I'll zoom out. I see another pattern, and one is actually in the process of studying it and things. I see a massive transformation in urban India, and I've spoken about it recently at JJ and things. You know, India has about 7 to 9 what are called mega cities. We have 27 tier 2 cities, and then we have 392 tier 3 cities. And I'm sorry, I'm going into statistics because this is the only way I can. So the mega cities are interesting. They're called mega cities because they have populations over 7 or 9 million people. So in a sense, their resource is people. So Mumbai, you know, you have world city, you have global city and all of that. But mega city, the only criteria or metric is people. This comes from World Bank giving money for water, transportation and things. So it's a metric that has come from another kind of dynamic. But we have 7 mega cities. These are going to become actually irrelevant in my view. They will yet be centers of power. People who love to live in Delhi, the moneyed people who love to live in Bombay. But these are going to not be the centers of innovation. If we are hoping these are going to turn around, yes, they will, because a lot of intellectual capital is here. We all, you know, we'll improve things. But I think we shouldn't lock our sights here. The 27 cities are already bubbling. And I can take a challenge here, and I always do this, that even in those 27 cities, collectively we'll come up with maybe 20 names. We won't even finish 27. And then you have 393 cities that are, and there are actually 5,000 that actually qualify as towns. So forget about that. Let's just look at these. These are cities that are somewhere between 100,000 people plus today. They are projected in 20 years to become 1 million people. Cities, which means you're going to have 400 million Indians living in places that I can bet you we won't be able to name more than 20 or 30 of. These are totally outside our radar, okay? Now, why are they important? They're important because I think they are, I'm sorry it's going a little longer, but they are sites of little contestation. They're not as contested as Bombay, where for every square inch, people are killing each other and things like that, right? So they're not. But the other side of it is they have no capacity in terms of intellectual engagement with it. So they don't have an architect, they often don't have planners. And that's the reason why the JNRUM that was celebrated, all the money got sucked up in all these flyovers, over flyovers and things, because these people can't even write an application to get the money. So the money went to the big cities, which is ridiculous, and we've built such heavy, ugly infrastructure where we don't need it often. Yeah? So some people benefit from it, 1% of the car-owning population or some such thing. So those landscapes are going to explode. They're going to explode in a dramatic way. You can already see it. I see it as I travel around India. I saw it when I just sort of have come back from this trip. It's totally amazing. So that is the background. Now, if you look at the vision of the new government, what they're already talking about, the bullet trains, the freeways, the new 100 new towns, this is where it's all got to be on land that, if they're going to do that, it's going to be on land that is tabula rasa, that is between these towns. Yeah, correct. And so you're building Bombay to Delhi as an urban corridor. There's going to be a mad out of, and these are going to be cities where, in fact, I think Suketu Mehta said this is not my thought. He said we shouldn't even be using the word inclusive cities, because when we say inclusive cities, we already have defined a problem that they are excluding people, so now we are trying to include them. So we start by making a city, and then we say, how can we make it more inclusive? So he was saying we should turn it around. How do we make cities that are not exclusive, you know, in a sense? And this is a completely different challenge that's going to exist. Now, so that is where if you're talking about prediction, I don't even think we should be talking about Bombay when we talk about the prediction, because this is, I think he's totally right. It'll make itself, it'll remake itself, things will get appropriated, reappropriated, there'll be some crazy configuration, and we lead pretty cool lives here. I mean, it'll be a happening place and all of that. But, you know, we have to wake up to the fact that there's an urban time bomb that this country is sitting on, which is going to affect all of us. It'll affect us in different ways. It'll affect us because we won't get carpenters, we won't get labor, because there'll be people living, you won't get drinking water, you won't get energy maybe. So it's going to be it's going to be totally mind-boggling, I think, what's going to happen. And so those predictions that used to happen in the turn of the last centuries of continuous urbanization, megapolises, it's like, I think we're on the threshold. And this is scary. It's the new frontier. And I think it's going to be the big challenge for all my friends here who educate young architects and planners and, you know, for artists and for everyone else. Ranjit has been waiting.
That was a terrific apocalyptic note to go out on, so I'll just ask you my question later, Rahul.
Okay.
So I'm a postgrad management student in development studies. So my question would be, let's hypothetically remove the regulations and the ownership part of the mills that are now in ruins. So how would, you know, what's your take on how naive this idea would be to, you know, put these ruined or the ruins of these mills into a social enterprising idea of, you know, reconstruction of these monumental things into, you know, infrastructure things like, and taking the sustainable route for things like rainwater harvesting or maybe social infra projects or, you know, things like hospitals, rehab for sex workers or, you know, things like that. Because like in Ahmedabad, there is a place called Naroda. In Naroda, there is a mill. It's shut down. Now it's used as a homeless shelter. I've been there, I stayed there for a night in the rains. So the thing is, leaving aside the, you know, legality part, Bombay has Dharavi and the red light district together in one particular city, and it requires maybe thinking ahead, as you said, imagining a new dawn of the city, taking these things into consideration, putting maybe reconstruction of this landscape into for really socially acceptable means.
Should I take it?
No, this is a question for the architect and the planner.
No, I mean, I think it's not a naive idea. And I just would, the way I would respond to that is that I think you also touch upon a very critical issue. I hate to, you know, sound like the critique of the new government and their rhetoric and their words and all of that. But again, I think infrastructure, we have to think of physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. Too much of the discussion is physical infrastructure. And I think societies can't or cities can't grow or even develop without social infrastructure. So in the same way as we talk about physical infrastructure with all the josh that we are talking about, we should bring social infrastructure into that discussion. And what you're describing is really social infrastructure that has to exist. So freeways is one thing, connecting these things with bullet trains is another thing, water, all of that. But social infrastructure in terms of building civil society in a way that you were talking about, that it's not just for capital, but also for people-centric. So entrepreneurship can take many forms to do that.
It's like the social cost-benefit analysis of it. It's already sunk. The cost is sunk. There is nothing there as such. Yeah. Reviving it or reconstruction would take, you know, the amount of money or the capital to be put in, half the thing is done. You have the land, you have the infra, you have the setup base. Reconstruct and put in the social, or maybe just put in the human effort into it. It might work. So, but the thing is, being from the development studies, I don't know anything about architecture or landscape or planning. But this does come up in discussions now and then on forums, not only related to architecture, but also in the other parts. So.
Good luck. Yes.
Ready?
Oh my God, right.
The person who owns that land has to be willing to.
But you know, that's another interesting debate that I think we have to take on head. I mean, Shirish Patel, Charles, and people have talked about this. Is this idea that you can take lands that were given historically for particular uses, like rail yards or mills, and then convert them into land that is used for malls? Yeah, I know we've done that, but that is also a basic. No, I know, correct. But I'm saying that's an aberration in the way of planning instruments, in a sense. And I mean, correct. No, so the point is, I mean, let me just, I don't have anything more except this to say, Gyan, you can conclude it, is that I think all this discussion, there's no point even going back, but I think what we can do is to see how it can resonate for many other parts of the city that are going to have the same fate. And if we don't learn from that, then we've really failed as a society. And I think, at least for me, the prime one that is staring us in the face is the eastern waterfront. And Nitin Gadkari has named a committee which was in the press. Hafiz Contractors on it, Pankaj Joshi is on it, luckily from the UDRI, but there are many others. But his first image or impression for it, he wanted to do the London Eye as a Ferris wheel there. So I mean, if that becomes the starting point, then I think we are going to go the same way as the Milllands. And I think it will be silly if we can't get our act together before that. So, Kalpana.
I just, in response to your earlier point about where people here in the city missed out, I would suggest that actually in our imagination of the city, those of us living here did not think of Gyan as part of the city.
Totally.
And I think what I see in these images is the tragedy of that. That we keep talking about the city, but actually what is the city? The experience of the people living in Gyan, that reality was very different from the reality of the people who talked about the city.
That's right, totally.
And I think the same thing, if we don't learn the lesson from that, this engagement now with these future cities that are being talked about, and we decide we have nothing to do with it because we are comfortable with Bombay, we are going to face the same kind of thing on a much larger scale.
Which is why I say the gaze should shift there. Otherwise, I think, like I always say, the solutions to Dharavi don't lie in Dharavi. We all seem to be fetishizing Dharavi to the point we are fixing something, and but it's actually the solutions to Dharavi lie in the way we can orchestrate the metropolitan region, and that discussion we are not engaging with. So this is, I think, the contradictions in our own imagination.
I mean, I think one of the things that the exhibit sort of brings out is that normally how do we think of cities? I mean, there are many ways to think about cities. I mean, one way is to, someone has called a concept city, where you begin with drawings, plans, and so on, and the other is roughly an imagined city, a city which is about experience and its and how you represent that experience. And I think here is Meera's sort of experience of this kind of a mill landscape, which she then represents in certain kinds of images, which is part of kind of urban life. As I said, this is not an ethnographic project. Like 10 years, 15 years from now, a historian might look at kind of remnants or fragments of this and treat it as an aspect of urban life and urban imagination. Now, in order to do that, I think you have, I'm not saying that, plans and, all these kind of big ideas are not important, but this is vitally important to think of the city as an experience and how one represents those experiences. Those are really vital. I mean, this is not just some arty-sharty crowd and, it's not, it's like, only for time pass. I mean, I don't think that's the idea. I mean, this is vital. This is what we live.
Yeah. The critical, you're absolutely right. I just would extend that. I'm sorry, just stop us whenever you have to. But I would just say that, an even more critical aspect is, how does that then inform people who have the power to make those decisions? And if you look at planning, this is worldwide. Through the 60s, it was exactly, you have put it very beautifully, that it was about cities that are thought through plans and instruments like that, which was the modernist city. That sort of created very brutal landscapes in a sense, and even in planning discourse within the academy and things around the world, India, the US, the social sciences began to challenge and invade that. But what happened in the process is that it set a paralysis among planners and architects. And you have this phase in the 90s and the 2000s, which I see happening in many schools of architecture here, where architects and planners are actually sounding like social scientists. They've forgotten their own craft. And I think the big challenge ahead of us is how we can actually use these readings as things that inform the discourse within those disciplines to begin to create the mesh. Otherwise, you're beginning to have a division or you have a co-option, because that rhetoric from a moralistic perspective, from ideologies and things is so seductive, rightly so, that it sets paralysis among planners. And I think what has gone out of planning and architecture generally is the speculative edge, which is its greatest strength. And how you represent that speculation, how you create the feedback loops to do exactly what you're saying, rather than the schism. I think that really is the challenge.
Yeah.
Urbanism.
Go up front. Okay. So thank you.
Bring back the past? I mean, I don't think... no, you know, the thing, I think past is important in the sense that the past must be made to speak to the present in a way. Not past to be venerated and frozen in a museum, but past which is active, which is dynamic, which asks questions about what's going on, rather than letting the present, interrogate the past and say, tell us about, what you were like. And then, we'll sit back and say how nice it was or how terrible it was, whatever. So, this kind of active engagement with the past is what I find, very present over here. And it's what I think, a real history or a real historian ought to do, is to engage with the past, not to silence it, but to make it speak.
But do you see that imagination part of things, if you organically go into these machines, these brutal structured machines, the cars are regular, abandoned, doing mills. And there is a moment of joy, that there is life which happens by itself, whether you put in the effort or not, but it's happening in that somebody like an artist is looking at that joy. She's looking at that
No, I mean, it is happening. I mean, and I think, the artist then has to, or represents it, or make sense of it. How do you make sense of it? I mean, what Meera does, she doesn't just present a kind of a picture of it. I mean, there's a kind of framing that the artist provides, and an interpretation that, it's, I mean, actually, I hadn't thought of it, but, the image of the tiger, somehow the Shiv Sena connection wasn't there, but, I mean, now that you spoke of it, I said, of course. Yeah.
Walking over all the land.
Right, yeah.
So,
but the question, I'll just say one last thing because you prompted it. Your question, it also leads to the question that always comes up when we are interrogating the past, which is the question of identity. And we take identity as being static. And I think what Gyan was alluding to is when you say how the past informs the present, identity is about construction. If we don't find, we make this mistake of, we got to look for our identity as if it's something you find and then you place. Identity we construct every day just by what we relate to and what we put our values in. And so sometimes your identity gets very muddled, as someone was asking, and sometimes your identity is crystal clear. When we were becoming a new nation, our identity was very clear. We had transitioned out of the values Gandhi put to us. There was an architectural identity that was constructed, etc. It got very muddled as it got fractured, which is not a bad thing. But I think we have to be aware that the past becomes an instrument. And that's why I talked about the way you can use the past to modulate the rate of change. Because some societies can construct those identities quickly through draconic means, through autocracies. In democracies, it's negotiated and much slower. Yeah. And the past becomes a part of that whole process.
And also, I mean, you know, just continuing in that thought, think of the recent controversy over Wendy Doniger's book. Now, that's a clear case of the present trying to put a certain interpretation on the past and saying only this vision of the past is correct. And if Wendy Doniger's book presents a certain other image of the past, which in fact questions a present image or present construction of, let's say, Hindu heritage, then, you know, the present gets all worked up and says, no, you know, we have to suppress it, we have to kill it, we have to pulp it, and so on. So there is an example where the past can actually be, you know, not an instrument of the present, not a handmaiden of the present, but something that questions a present construction of identity, you know.
Are you done, Rahul? Thank you, Gyan and Rahul. Thank you, Meera, for your exhibition has really opened up so many different questions, and it's really been a privilege to have you both.